So, to give a bit of an overview of just, I'm sure many of you on the call today kind of have an idea of invasive species and some of their impacts already, but I wanted to just provide a bit of a snapshot of what the invasive species issue really is and what's the concern. So, about 58% of invasive plant species have been deliberately introduced to Canada through the horticulture trade, whether by being agronomic crops, landscape plants, ornamentals, or medicinal plants through their introduction. So that's quite a lot, and they've been introduced over many decades as well. Many of them are their introduction is associated with colonization as well. And these species have can have a variety of negative impacts. So for those who aren't aware, an invasive species is a species that's defined as a species introduced out of its native range and has impacts on either the economy, the society, or the environment, or hitting multiple of those factors. So with invasive plants, they can have a variety of impacts within those different sectors as well. And I wanted to just provide just a few examples of some of those invasive introduced plants and what their impacts are. So for our first example, we have garlic mustard. This is a species that outcompetes native species. You can see here that it's sort of created this carpet on the forest floor that's really not allowing for any other species to grow there. It's considered an allelopathic species, which means that it puts chemicals into the soil that prevent the growth of other species around it. So it's very competitive that way. And you can see it's really kind of reducing biodiversity in this forest. Another example is impacting infrastructure, or you might say this is kind of under that economy type factor, and that's Japanese knotweed. It's a really hardy plant, very fast growing, and has been known to grow through infrastructure like the foundations of homes, or like you can see here, there's a concrete pad that it's growing through as well. On the right image, you can see it's even entered someone's house from the outside. So a very, very hardy plant and can definitely have some impacts there. Another impact is human health, and giant hogweed's sort of the poster child for this impact. Many people are aware of this species, especially in the news. It gets a lot of attention as well. So it's a very tall species. It has these white umbrella flowers. So really interesting, and was introduced through the ornamental trade. Unfortunately, however, if the sap does get on your skin and then is exposed to sunlight, it can cause some pretty bad burns. So that's one of those examples of impacts to human health. But there can be a variety of different impacts, and most of them always impact our ecosystems as well. And you can imagine that, having these in your garden is one thing, but because they've been introduced without any sort of predator to kind of keep their populations in check, they can really become very weedy in your garden. And once they escape, that's where they start to have those bigger impacts and are able to spread further and further. So many invasive garden plants have also been popularized over time. So we're thinking like English ivy, lily of the valley, periwinkle, where many people have been putting them in their gardens for many years. So they're very well established in communities, and they're also well established in the horticulture trade. People go to retailers and are asking for these species because they might not be aware that they're invasive, and they might not be aware that there's an alternative that could be used for that species within their region. And there's just a look at periwinkle that does a really great job as a ground cover, as you can see there. So why PlantWise? So PlantWise works to stop the spread of horticulture invasive species and has kind of two main components, at least at the national level. And one of those is building partnerships. So we work with industry partners, government partners, and others to really build those industry partnerships to really support industry, provide tools to help phase out invasive species and other actions to stop the spread of invasive species within the trade. The other component is education, and that's really about educating everyone, educating to work together to solving this problem. So gardeners, garden retailers, nurseries, growers, and landscape industry. And some of the highlights of what we focus on for education, although it's definitely beyond this, is stopping the buying, trading, and selling of invasive plants, promoting non-invasive alternatives, so whether that's native species or cultivars that are not invasive, controlling or replacing invasive species that exist in gardens and other areas, and then also ensuring there's proper disposal practices so that when we are removing those invasive species, we're not spreading them further, for example, through compost. So a little snapshot of where we're sort of at with the national program, some of its history. It really all started in 2017 when the National Horticulture and Invasive Plant Working Group was kind of established by the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. It included groups like the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, Canadian Nursery Landscape Association, and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And together, this group collaborated with industry to develop tools and approaches to support, again, that transition to stopping the spread of invasives within the industry. So two key resources that came out of that work was the National Voluntary Code of Conduct. As the name suggests, this is a voluntary code that can be followed by industry members. They sign on and agree to start taking some of the actions listed in the Code of Conduct to prevent the spread. So an example of some of these might be to, excuse me, to make sure that species are labeled with their scientific name as well as common names. A lot of the time, invasive species can have multiple common names, so it can cause some confusion to what that species actually is. So making sure that scientific name is there, along with, as you run out of your invasive species stock, trying phasing it out and bringing in those alternatives if you're a retailer, for example. Another resource is Canada's Worst Invasive Plant List. This is separate from the Code of Conduct and is really just a snapshot of what invasive plant species are out there and in the horticulture trade. So this was developed from looking at lists of invasive species from different provinces and territories, as well as regulated species. So really is just a snapshot, but it's definitely not inclusive of all invasive plants out there. Another component to the work we do is national events and webinars like this one. We most recently hosted a national conference. It was a 2-day event in November where we had a lot of talk between different partners and heard a lot of really great thoughts on next steps that the CCIS can then take and lead as we expand the PlantWise program. The other piece of work that we do is collaborating with our chapter network. So our chapters are made up of invasive species councils in different provinces and territories across Canada. Currently, we have 10 provinces and territories within our chapter network. So this has been a really fundamental piece to expanding the PlantWise program. Together, we work to build strong, consistent messaging and tools, increase the reach of the program, as well as just to support its expansion in the resources it has across Canada. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of some of the work our chapters have been doing on PlantWise and Grow Me Instead, excluding the 4 circled here, which our other speakers will talk to today. So for the Maritimes, we have the PEI Invasive Species Council. So they recently surveyed horticulture industry stakeholders, and the goal of this was to have results to help guide actions by identifying challenges to stakeholders and any knowledge gaps to kind of support resource development. They've also recently done a follow-up survey with home gardeners to kind of understand, again, those gaps, what resources are sort of needed to support these different groups. For our Western provinces, we have the Alberta Invasive Species Council. They're celebrating 10 years of their Grow Me Instead guide, which is really excellent. And they work to distribute that guide to municipalities, horticulture groups, and garden groups. They have offered 27 alternatives to 9 invasive species listed in the guide. They also have, they host many booth events, reaching a large audience, as well as are looking to expand their resources for this program. For Saskatchewan Invasive Species Council, they have a voluntary code of conduct program, as well as a Grow Me Instead guide that started in 2008. They have a number of partners within the province, and they also have worked with a local magazine, Gardeners for the Prairies, to help, which has a 45,000 readership. So really great to kind of get the message out through those different pathways. and they also attend different events to support the program as well. For Northern Canada, we have the Yukon Invasive Species Council. They also have a PlantWise program. They recently came out with a new educational plant native game, so definitely I encourage you to check out their website to find that. They have a mini Grow Me Instead guide as well as a PlantWise brochure and many courses and events as well to check out. The Northwest Territory Council on Invasive Species, Pests, and Pathogens also has a PlantWise program and supports actions under the National Voluntary Code of Conduct. They have fact sheets on different introduced pest species and continue to raise awareness on the program as well. It's just a really brief overview of some of the great work that our chapters are doing more locally in their provinces and territories. So just in terms of next steps for this program, there are many kind of details around this, but this is just a really high level of what next steps we're doing at the national level. So we're continuing to have that strong, consistent approach to PlantWise, working with our chapters and other partners to do so. We're working to clarify and create strong rationale on how invasive species are identified, such as the regionality, hybrids, cultivars, and all those sort of nuances. We're working to have engagement and relationship building within the horticulture sector, including communication and training. And this was really something that came out of our recent conference that really highlighted the need for that communication and training piece with industry. We're also working with the Invasive Species Council in BC to learn from their pilot program as a recognized retailer program and to expand that nationally this year. So I'll let Emma Nicol talk a little bit more about that. So I'll pass it off to Emma to kind of give an overview of what's going on at the Invasive Species Council of BC and their PlantWise program.
Thanks, Gabby. I'll just share my screen here. Perfect.
Looks great.
Wonderful. Okay, yeah, so I'm happy to be here today to share a bit about the PlantWise program in BC. Like Gabby said, I'm an outreach coordinator with the Invasive Species Council of BC, and I'm currently co-leading the PlantWise program. And as our team works across the province, I do want to gratefully acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories on which we live, work, and learn. I myself am currently coming to you today from the traditional lands of the Secwepemc people. I'm up in Williams Lake, BC. So our mission at ISCBC is to take action to build healthy landscapes, habitats, and communities through education and responsible practices to prevent the spread of invasive species. And to do this, we are focused on education, outreach, training, and lots of collaboration between the regions in BC, provinces and territories across Canada, and across borders internationally. So jumping right into the PlantWise program in BC, as Gabby mentioned, this program is dedicated to stopping the spread of horticultural invasive species. And one of the main components of this program is the Grow Me Instead guide, which in BC was first launched in 2009 and went through a substantial refresh in 2021. So just a brief history on how we got started with Grow Me Instead. It was actually modeled after a Grow Me Instead program in Australia. And in 2009, we had a speaker from Western Australia come out to share about the program there. So some of the main takeaways were that it really had to be nursery and garden industry led. And actually how they funded it in Australia was through what they call a pot tax. So it meant that a few cents from each potted plant sold went to supporting the program. So that's pretty interesting. From there, a very diverse advisory committee was formed with industry, gardeners, botanists, and others to take a look at the current species in trade, develop a list of which species were considered invasive, and then come up with a list of similar looking alternatives that were either native or non-native, non-invasive species that were also currently in trade. In 2011, the first Grow Me Instead guide was available in BC, and in 2014, this program expanded to PlantWise. So moving forward, the key components are continuing to work with growers, retailers, and gardeners, consistently looking to improve the guide, and like I said previously, including both native and non-native species alternatives. So our current Grow Me Instead guide lists 33 invasive plants with a corresponding list of non-natives, non-invasives to grow instead. This guide is available in several forms. So we have an online searchable web-based guide and in print form as wallet cards, snapshot brochures, and a more comprehensive booklet. In 2021, we had a big refresh and this included the development of the online guide and increased the number of invasive species listed, and the addition of invasive aquatic, green roof, and tree species to reflect the broader horticultural industry. So here is just a quick look at the snapshot brochure. So it includes the invasive species. In the snapshot, there are 28 listed currently, and gives 2 alternative options. So it's a pretty brief overview, but it's kind of a nice little guide. Whereas the online guide on our website has a more comprehensive list of invasives and gives 4 to 5 alternatives, all of which are searchable as well. And if we click on one of the invasive species, you'll find information about the species and how to identify it. And if you scroll down the page or go back to the main page, you can click on the alternative species to learn more about them. So some of the key features on these pages is the zone information, and it will also list if the species is a BC native or not. And below, there are special features to consider if you're looking for drought tolerant, fire smart, bear smart, and our pollinator friendly species, as well as the moisture requirements. So lots of extra information in the online guide. That's super helpful. And if you want to take a look at that guide, there we go. Here's just a quick QR code if you want to take a look at that online. So some of our other resources include a PlantWise e-learning course available on our website, which walks you through the impacts and how horticultural invasive species spread, goes through some common invasive species still for sale, and some alternatives to look for instead. We also have fact sheets and other publications available on our website to learn more about PlantWise and topics such as how to dispose of invasive plants properly. And another more recent component to the PlantWise program is the Recognized Retailer program that Gabby mentioned, and this aims to work with retailers to reduce the spread of invasive species through the horticulture industry. We've had some variations of this program in the past years, but in 2023, we ran a Recognized Retailer program pilot project in BC as a joint collaboration with the Canadian Council, with the goal of adapting and expanding the program from BC to other provinces and territories. An expert advisory group was formed to develop the project and included experts from horticulture, the landscape industry, plant retailers, and the regional invasive species organizations in BC. And this pilot ran during the summer of 2023, and retail partners from across BC were invited to participate. We had representative partners from regions across BC, and these partners consisted of locally owned horticultural businesses with a storefront selling live plants and/or seeds. The participating partners were asked to agree to a voluntary code of conduct. They received resources from ISCBC, including digital and physical resources, so things like the PlantWise brochures, wallet cards, posters, and recognized retailer stickers, as well as a program implementation guide and the e-learning course available on our website. We met with partners bi-weekly and they provided feedback on the program. So overall, the feedback about the aims and intent of the program were very positive. Some of the key areas to work on are updates to the implementation methods. For example, a lot of the retailers really wanted more in-person training, so that was kind of key feedback there. Future resources on species with particular regards to regionality. So since the Grow Me Instead Guide is province-wide, there are some invasive species that don't grow in all regions, and so addressing questions about the sale of those species. And in the same vein, consistency between provincial and regional lists to follow, and questions about the species cultivars that may be considered sterile and things like that. So just more resources available for which species to be considering. So lots of great feedback. We've got some work to do, and we are in the process of moving forward with the program and hope to have more updates on the full launch for you soon. So with that, I want to thank you for having me come share. It was pretty quick, but if you have any questions beyond this webinar, feel free to reach out through email there, and I will pass it off to Vicky next.
Great, thank you, Emma. That was very interesting. I'll share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
We can see it now. Yep.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone. And my name is Vicky. I'm the program coordinator for the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. And today I'll be giving a brief overview of the Grow Me Instead program for OIPC, how it got started, its successes, and some challenges over the years. So first, to just provide a bit of background and history, the Grow Me Instead program was initiated by the Horticultural Outreach Collaborative, and this is a committee of OIPC that formed in 2010 when a group of ecologists and horticulturalists gathered together to discuss the issue of invasive garden plants and decided to that their focus would be on this horticultural pathway of spread. It's currently co-chaired by Colin Casson and myself. And members of the HOC include representatives from a variety of NGOs, academic institutes, and government agencies in Ontario. So in 2011, the HOC launched the Grow Me Instead Guide, which is a booklet very similar to BC's that informs gardeners on common garden plants that have invasive tendencies and provides specific non-invasive alternatives to those species that are comparable and perform well in Ontario. So the idea was to assist gardeners in making informed decisions about the plants they're buying so that they can avoid invasive plants. And this by far continues to be HOC's most popular and successful initiative and is the most popular OIPC resource. There are three main publications sort of when we say Grow Me Instead. So there's the Southern Grow Me Instead Guide for Southern Ontario. There's a French version of the Southern Ontario Guide. And then there's a Northern Ontario Grow Me Instead Guide. And all of these are available for free download on our website. And to the right, you can see some of the partner logos of who are the main players involved, but it was really a collaborative approach to the production of these guides. Partners of the HOC got together, so it was all their sort of collaborative expertise that led to the production of these guides. And the idea for the guide was actually adapted from the Invasive Species Council of BC's Grow Me Instead Guide. And then just to take you through a little bit of inside the guide. So we have various invasive plants that are highlighted in different sections. So we have ground covers, wildflowers and grasses, vines, trees and shrubs, and aquatics. And just so you see here, there's an example of, your unwanted invasive plant like yellow flag iris, and then it'll mention several alternatives. So the alternative species, we're chosen based on whether they were proven to be non-invasive or native. So it's just important to note, like, not every species is a native species to Ontario. Sometimes it wasn't possible to pair every a native species to every invasive plant based on growing conditions, etc. So where possible, it would be native, but sometimes non-invasive non-native species were also mentioned in this guide. So it was also based on whether the alternative was easily found in the horticulture industry, if it was widespread and available to the public, then it would also be included, or if it had similar requirements like shape and garden use as a potentially invasive species. So roughly trying to make it as comparable as possible. And for the Southern Grow Me Instead guide, we have had several versions since the initial edition in 2011. The most recent edition was published in 2020. That was our third edition, and that's the most comprehensive GMI guide yet, with 36 new species added, and several updates were made, such as updating plant profiles, photos, and more information on plant availability and wildlife connections. So in the new guide, there's 29 invasive species and 68 alternatives provided. And looking beyond, we're hoping to be able to fund another update to the Southern Grow Me Instead guide very soon. So that'll be great to be able to update this guide. And also just note that the Northern and French versions haven't yet been updated since their publication. So in terms of promotion, so over the years, thousands of people have picked up these guides in person, the paper version, at various events like horticultural trade shows or CD Saturdays, Master Gardener events. But the last print run of the guides was shortly after the Southern Grow Me Instead update was completed in 2020. And since then, due to loss of ministry funding, staffing limitations, and the pandemic, we've not been able to print more guides. And we've shifted towards more encouraging the public to download our resources online. So social media continues to be our most frequent way that we advertise the guides. So here's just some examples of posts we've done recently. And we continue to actively promote. And in 2024, Facebook posts related to GMI reached 55,000 impressions, 3,000 engagements, and 450 shares. For Instagram, reached 2,000 impressions, 160 engagement, and 46 shares. So we by far have the most following on our Facebook page. And just to mention a few other resources that we've had over the years. So a lot of resources were just based on, the success of those Grow Me Instead guides. So bookmarks around 2015 were launched, seed packets around 2016. So we had a Northern Ontario seed packet, which was the anise hyssop, and then the wildflower mix for Southern Ontario. In the early days, we also had a Grow Me Instead nursery recognition program that got initiated in 2012. So that was sort of giving credit to different nurseries who plant native, and we had for some time their name and website available on our website. We haven't engaged with this program since due to loss of funding and other priorities, but definitely with the PlantWise, and it's definitely something we hope to maybe expand on in the future. And just to show a couple stats here, from 2010 to 2020, over 73,000 guides were distributed at various events, 6,000 seed packets, and 5,000 bookmarks. And just some other resources. Over the years, we've held many workshops. In the past, they were mostly in person, so a lot of in-person workshops for master gardener groups and other gardening events. But since the pandemic, we've moved more online to online webinars, and this is an upcoming webinar we have on April 18th on the Grow Me Instead guide, and registration is full already with 500 registered. So it just shows the great success of the Grow Me Instead and the interest there is in native gardening and learning more about it. On November 8th and 9th, in partnership with CCIS, we launched the first National Horticulture Conference, and that was held via the Remo online platform. So that was again focused on the horticultural pathway of spread. And some challenges and future goals. I think one challenge we've always had has been printing of our resources. There continues to be great demand to have this guide in person on paper. It's just it's not the same to just look at it online. A lot of people want that paper copy, and that can sometimes be challenging in terms of like getting funding for printing, and also having a place to store those guides, because we no longer have an office. So that continues to be kind of a challenge, and something we hope to continue to resolve into the future. And funding, of course, being able to support many of the great initiatives surrounding GMI and expand it, that's something we're always focused on as well. So thank you. That's my presentation, and you can reach me at this email here if you have any more questions. So thank you. So I'll pass it on to Houston.
All right, thank you, Vicky. Great presentation. I'm just going to get my slides up. Okay, so we should be good to go there. Yeah, so hello everyone. My name is Houston Grimshaw-Thread. I am the Terrestrial Project Coordinator with the Nova Scotia Invasive Species Council. And so I'll be talking about what we're doing here in Nova Scotia in regards to the PlantWise program. So the PlantWise program here in Nova Scotia is pretty new. It's only been implemented for the past few years, so we are on the earlier stages of it. And so our current focus is creating more awareness of invasive plant species used in gardening practices. So talking about what they are, how to identify these invasive plant species, why they are problems. It's not only important to say what they are, but also talk about why they're problems. So communicating that and creating more education about invasive plant species. Also, though, about how to prevent their spread. So talking with gardeners, how to prevent already established plant species from spreading and how to control them, how to properly dispose of invasive plant species when they are removed, and as well as talking about other invasive species that are also tied to the horticultural industry. So invasive earthworms, for example, that can be moved around in contaminated soil, and just trying to create all this awareness. And so here in Nova Scotia, we do have 10 regulated plant species as a part of the Agricultural Weed Act, which was implemented in 2003. But it is an agricultural weed act, so it does not focus on horticultural plant species. So we are focusing our attention therefore then on a bottom-up approach, so working with gardeners and nurseries, talking about invasive plant species and creating that education and awareness, rather than a top-down regulatory aspect. So how are we doing this? Well, through outreach events. So attending environmental events, setting up booths, talking to the public about invasive plant species. We also have a series of talks we've been doing at garden clubs. This spring, we have a bunch with some local garden clubs here in Nova Scotia, talking about invasive plant species and creating that awareness, and also providing resources. So whether it be PlantWise stickers, trowels with the branding on it to try and as reminder items about PlantWise practices. And a key component of our resources that we have implemented is our Grow Me Instead guidebook. So this was released last summer, 2023, so pretty new. This guidebook has been a collaboration between the Nova Scotia Invasive Species Council as well as New Brunswick Invasive Species Council. And so we worked together, the two councils, to create this guidebook. And we had a lot of help as well from the Harriet Irving Botanical Gardens, which is a garden as a part of the Acadia University here in Nova Scotia. So they provided a lot of guidance in terms of the native plants to be chosen and the descriptions and so on. And so the purpose of this guidebook is to be a reference tool for gardeners to make plant-wise choices and to create more awareness of non-invasive plant species to be used in gardening practices to try and shift the demand away from invasive plant species. So the guidebook includes 55 different invasive species, includes a variety of different trees, shrubs, vines, ground covers, flowers, grasses, aquatic species, and lists two native alternatives for each invasive species listed. So in the guidebook, there's 94 native alternatives. These alternatives are unique for each species, so there was no duplication between the different invasive plant species. And you will notice, though, that those numbers don't add up between the 55 and 94 native alternatives, and that's because some of the invasives are grouped together. So the invasive maples were grouped together into one category, the invasive honeysuckles were grouped together in one category, and so on. And so for this guidebook for native alternatives, we did choose native species to be included as a native alternative. So all of the alternatives included in the guidebook are native to this region. And so we did this to reduce risks of introducing potentially new invasive plant species, as well as native species support and maintain food webs. So it's super important to be planting native plant species, and we wanted to try and increase that awareness of native plant species used in gardening practices. Because here in Nova Scotia, there isn't too much of a demand currently. There is definitely a shift towards it, but we're trying to increase that demand and how good native plants can be used in gardening practices. And so we considered a species as native if it was from the Wabanaki Forest region. This region covers the 3 maritime provinces and includes all ecosystem types. So even though it says forest region, it includes all ecosystems and includes about 1,200 vascular plant species native to the region. And so how do we choose the plants? Well, in terms of invasive species, these were invasive plants that are already known to be invasive to the region. So multiflora rose, Japanese knotweed, and so on. But we also included some species that are expected to become invasive. So some of these species aren't exhibiting the invasive qualities here in Nova Scotia, and could be sleeper species, which means that as the environment becomes more favorable for them, with shifting of climates, they could become invasive. So these are species that have known to be invasive in other areas of North America, and so we want to include them in the guidebook as well. Then for the native alternatives, we want them to be native to the Wabanaki Forest region, so they're all native to that region. They also have similar desired characteristics and growing conditions as the invasive plant species that they are put in to replace. Also, we wanted to select plants that are known to be hosts of native wildlife species to restore native food webs and available for purchase. So that's another important thing. It can be difficult to find native plant species. And so we wanted to include native plant species that are known to be sold, whether it be in New Brunswick or Nova Scotia. So here is a few pages from the guidebook itself and kind of how it's laid out. So we've got the invasive species listed at the top, the unwanted species, and then below you've got the native alternatives below. So you've got in green there, and with the information with the invasive species talks about why it's invasive, why you wouldn't want to have it in a garden. And then with the native alternatives talks about the garden use, its growing conditions, size and shape, features, as well as some additional information. So we want to include information on if it's a popular species used by pollinators, or if bird species may feed on the berries, and so on. So in terms of the success of the guidebook, a lot of the feedback has been positive. So a lot of support from gardeners as well as nurseries about the Grow Me Instead guidebook. It has led to some additional resources being created. For example, the creation of a Nova Scotia native seed packet, a company called To and From Gift Co. Reached out to us after reading about the Grow Me Instead guidebook, and they wanted to create a seed pack which is native to Nova Scotia, and so they've been working with us to create this native seed packet. Also, we've had feedback from nurseries voluntarily changing their practices, so removing invasive plant species off their shelf and only ordering them if they are requested. But also informing that to the consumer that they are invasive species that they are purchasing. So the Grow Me Instead guidebook can be found online for free. 2 QR codes will take you to the 2 different versions. There's English as well as a French version. We also have recently purchased a large order of Grow Me Instead printable, some prints of it. So stay tuned for details about that. And in terms of next steps of our PlantWise program, we'll definitely expanding it and continuing the work that we're doing. So expanding the outreach efforts that we're doing and working with gardeners, garden clubs, nurseries, and building more of those relationships, as well as looking a lot more into the disposal aspects of invasive plant species, as that is a challenging aspect here. As we want to create some more uniformity across the province. But yeah. And so if you have any questions about the PlantWise program here in Nova Scotia, you can feel free to send me email, but we'll be opening up the questions now anyway. So yeah.